I never had a reason to doubt checkpoints. In convoy escort work, they are the most fixed elements of an otherwise fluid mission. Routes can change, speed can fluctuate, formations can stretch or compress, but checkpoints are supposed to remain constant. They exist to confirm that you are where you're supposed to be, at the time you're supposed to be there, and still operating inside controlled space. That night began like every other. The escort mission had been approved in advance. The route had been used repeatedly over the past month. 3 fixed checkpoints were clearly marked in the mission packet. There were no new warnings, no last-minute adjustments. We rolled out after full dark, maintaining standard spacing, lights off, relying exclusively on night vision equipment. I was positioned in the command vehicle in the middle of the convoy. My role wasn't to lead from the front, but to keep the rhythm, monitor spacing, vehicle responses, and ensure the column didn't stretch too far in areas without natural illumination. The first 15 minutes unfolded exactly as planned. Checkpoint 1 appeared exactly where it was supposed to. Proper identification. No stop required. We passed through according to pre-established procedure. Checkpoint 2 followed the same pattern. No changes in communications. No deviations in convoy behavior. No one mentioned Checkpoint 3 because there was no reason to. According to the mission documentation, the third checkpoint sat at the end of a narrow stretch of road where the terrain forced vehicles to slow before entering more open ground. It was marked with multiple layers of confirmation, coordinates, daytime imagery, physical description, and activity frequency. This was not a temporary position. As we approached that section, I began to decelerate out of habit. Not because of an alert, but because my body had memorized the pacing of this route. I had driven it enough times to know when to prepare to stop. But nothing appeared. There was no familiar infrared glow, no structural outline along the roadside, no personnel, no vehicles, no indication that a checkpoint had ever existed there. I checked my night vision device. Signal stable. Contrast normal. I glanced at the digital map mounted in the vehicle. The coordinates were still correct. The checkpoint icon was still present. Only the terrain disagreed. The convoy continued forward another few dozen meters by inertia before I ordered a temporary halt. Not an emergency stop. Just a pause to verify. No one overreacted. There was no tension in the radio traffic. I asked the lead vehicle to confirm visual contact. The response came quickly and without embellishment. No checkpoint observed. No one used the word missing. No one said gone. We simply acknowledged that what should have been there was not visible. I checked the map again, more carefully this time. There were no update alerts, no rerouting notices, no notation indicating the checkpoint had been deactivated. Checkpoint 3 still existed in the system. It just didn't exist in front of us. I waited a few seconds before reporting upward. Not out of hesitation, but because I was choosing my language. You don't say a checkpoint isn't there. You say you are unable to visually confirm. That was the exact phrasing I used. The response from higher came faster than I expected. Calm voice. No follow-up questions. No request for cross-checks. No instruction to turn around. The order was a single line. Continue the mission. There was no reference to checkpoint 3. And that was when I understood the issue wasn't what we were seeing, but what the system no longer required us to see. Once the order to continue was given, the convoy did what convoys always do. It absorbed the instruction without comment and resumed forward motion. Engines returned to steady output. Spacing re-established itself. Radios settled back into the low-level cadence of status updates and distance calls. From the outside, nothing about our movement would have suggested an irregularity had occurred. From the inside, everything had shifted. I kept my eyes alternating between the road and the map display. The checkpoint icon remained fixed in place, indifferent to the fact that we had just passed through its coordinates without encountering anything that matched its description. There was no system acknowledgement of a discrepancy, no warning tone, no prompt requesting verification. The map behaved as if visual confirmation were optional. That was not normal. Checkpoint procedures exist to reduce uncertainty. Even when you don't stop, their presence narrows the range of possible threats. They anchor a route to something tangible. Driving through a location that is supposed to provide that anchor, only to find nothing there, removes more than a reference point. It removes a layer of assurance that you don't realize you're relying on until it's gone. I requested a quiet internal check over the command net. Vehicle status, crew condition, night vision performance. Everything came back green. No one reported anything unusual beyond the absence of the checkpoint itself. No one sounded concerned. That bothered me more than if they had. We continued for several kilometers before the road widened and the terrain opened up. This was the point where the convoy usually relaxed slightly, where drivers allowed themselves a marginal increase in speed. I didn't permit it. I kept us at the reduced pace we would have maintained approaching a checkpoint, even though we were already well past where it should have been. I didn't explain why. At the next scheduled communications window, I made a second report. Again, I chose my words carefully. I confirmed mission progression. I noted that the convoy had passed all designated route markers. I did not restate the issue unless prompted. No prompt came. The acknowledgement was procedural and brief. Copy, continue as briefed. The phrase lodged itself in my head. As briefed. According to the brief, Checkpoint 3 was active. According to our movement, it wasn't. Both statements were being treated as compatible. That was the first time I considered the possibility that the checkpoint's function had never been physical in the first place. We reached the final waypoint without incident. The convoy dispersed according to plan. Engines shut down. Security was established. From a mission completion standpoint, everything had gone exactly as it was supposed to. There were no casualties, no delays, no deviations significant enough to trigger an immediate review. It was only after we were static that the weight of the earlier moment returned. I asked one of the drivers casually whether he had noticed anything off near the third checkpoint. He looked at me as if he didn't understand the question. Off how? He asked. Terrain, layout, anything unexpected? He thought for a moment, then shook his head. Looked like the same road it always does. That answer unsettled me. Not because it contradicted what I had seen, but because it didn't acknowledge the absence at all. For him, there had been no gap, no missing element, just continuous terrain. I asked another crew member the same question. His response was similar. No recollection of a checkpoint, but no sense that anything had been missing either. To him, there had simply been no checkpoint on that stretch of road, and apparently never had been. That was when I stopped asking. Back at the forward location, the after-action process began the way it always does. Logs were collected. Timelines were reviewed. Route adherence was confirmed. When we reached the section covering Checkpoint 3, the slide showed the same icon I had seen on the map during movement. No annotation accompanied it. I mentioned the visual non-confirmation once, during a pause in the briefing. I framed it as a data point, not a concern. The room didn't react. The officer running the review acknowledged the comment with a nod and moved on. There was no discussion. Later that evening, I reviewed my own notes. The ones I kept privately, separate from the official record. I had written down the time we crossed the checkpoint coordinates, and the distance travelled afterward before halting. The numbers were consistent with our speed and pacing. There was no discrepancy that could be blamed on miscalculation. The only inconsistency was the checkpoint itself. I cross-referenced older mission packets that used the same route. In every one of them, checkpoint 3 was present. Same designation, same coordinates, same description. The paperwork was thorough enough that its continued inclusion could not be accidental, which raised an obvious question. If the checkpoint no longer existed physically, why was it still being planned around? And if it still existed functionally, why did it not require a visible form? The answer did not come that night. It didn't come in the following days either. There were no follow-up messages, no corrections issued, no quiet instructions to disregard previous documentation. The system behaved as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. That silence told me something important. Whatever checkpoint 3 had been intended to do, it had already done it. And once that function was fulfilled, there was no reason for it to remain in a form that could be observed. In the days that followed, the route remained active. Other convoys used it. Different drivers, different command vehicles, the same documentation. Checkpoint 3 continued to appear in every packet, unchanged in language or placement, as if it were immune to revision. No footnotes, no temporary status markers. It was treated as permanent infrastructure. I paid closer attention than I normally would have. Not openly, just enough to notice what questions were not being asked. During one planning session, a junior officer flagged a minor timing discrepancy at checkpoint 2. It was resolved immediately. Adjustments were made. Notes were added to the packet. The process worked exactly the way it was designed to. That same officer never mentioned checkpoint 3, even though its absence should have carried more weight than a few minutes of delay. After the meeting, I asked him if he remembered that checkpoint from previous missions. He frowned, thinking. "I know it's on the route," he said, "but I don't think I've ever actually seen it." That statement landed harder than he realized. Not because it contradicted my experience, but because it aligned with it in an unexpected way. The checkpoint was familiar as an idea, not as a place. It existed in planning language, not in memory. I started reviewing older after-action reports. Not just ours, but ones going back months. References to checkpoint 3 were consistent, but always abstract. It was mentioned in timelines and route summaries, never in descriptive terms. No one wrote about its appearance. No one noted interactions there. It was acknowledged without being experienced. That absence of texture stood out. In convoy operations, checkpoints generate stories. Even when nothing happens, there's always something to remark on. A change in personnel, a vehicle parked at an odd angle, a radio call that didn't sound right. The fact that none of that existed for checkpoint 3 suggested that it had never been engaged with in a conventional way. I wondered if it had ever been staffed. That question stayed with me as I monitored subsequent missions. On one occasion, I was positioned far enough back in the convoy that I had a clear view of the vehicles ahead as they approached the coordinates. I watched their brake lights activate slightly earlier than necessary, then release again. A reflexive response. Muscle memory triggered by expectation. They slowed where something should have been, and then they continued. No one commented on it. No one asked why the pacing shifted for a location that held nothing. The adjustment happened automatically, as if the checkpoint still exerted influence without physical presence. That was when I began to think of it less as a structure and more as a boundary. Not a boundary you could see or mark, but one that had been integrated into behavior, training, assumptions. The route was shaped around it, whether it existed or not. I raised the issue one final time, indirectly, during a routine coordination call. I asked whether any checkpoints on the route had been downgraded or removed recently. The answer was immediate and definitive. Negative. All checkpoints active as briefed. No elaboration followed. After that, I stopped pushing. Not because I was satisfied, but because the pattern was clear. The checkpoint status was not open for discussion. It was not something that could be removed through inquiry. It persisted because the system required it to persist, regardless of its physical form. A few days later, I received an updated mission packet for an unrelated operation. Different route, different area of responsibility. I skimmed it out of habit, not expecting to see anything familiar. There were 4 checkpoints listed. 3 of them had names. The 4th did not. It was identified only by a designation number and a set of coordinates. No imagery attached. No descriptive text. Just a note at the bottom of the page. Visual confirmation not required beyond transit. I stared at that line longer than I should have. The wording was identical to a phrase buried deep in the documentation for our previous route. I hadn't noticed it at the time because it had been surrounded by so much standard language. Seeing it isolated made its intent clearer. Some checkpoints were not meant to be seen. They were meant to be crossed. I closed the packet and didn't bring it up to anyone else. By then, I understood that recognition was not a prerequisite for function. The system didn't need participants to understand what a checkpoint was doing. It only needed them to move through it as instructed. Whatever checkpoint 3 represented, it wasn't there to stop us, slow us, or verify our identities. It was there to mark something, and once that marking had been completed, its continued visibility was unnecessary. The realization changed the way I looked at routes entirely. I stopped thinking of them as lines drawn across terrain and started thinking of them as sequences, ordered movements through conditions that only occasionally expressed themselves as physical locations. Checkpoint 3 had been one of those conditions. The fact that it no longer manifested visually didn't mean it was gone. It meant it had transitioned into a different state. I tested that assumption quietly. On the next convoy, I escorted along the same route. I altered nothing operationally. Same spacing, same speed, same radio discipline. The only difference was internal. I paid attention to the moment we crossed the coordinates again, watching for any change that could not be attributed to habit or expectation. The vehicles slowed slightly, as they always did. Engines dipped in unison. The column compressed, then expanded. It was subtle enough that no one would have flagged it as noteworthy, but consistent enough that it could not be coincidence. The checkpoint still exerted influence. It just did so without form. I watched the terrain closely this time. Not for structures or personnel, but for absence. The road surface showed no wear patterns that would suggest repeated stops. No tire scarring. No disturbed earth. Nothing that would indicate the checkpoint had ever occupied physical space for more than a moment at a time. That raised another possibility I hadn't considered before. If the checkpoint had never been persistent, then its removal hadn't been an event. There had been nothing to dismantle, nothing to relocate. It hadn't disappeared because it had never fully existed in the way we understood existence. It had simply stopped appearing. That thought was reinforced during a later briefing when a logistics officer referred to the route as fully validated. Not secured, not cleared, validated. The word choice was deliberate. Validation doesn't imply defense. It implies confirmation that something behaves as expected. Expected by whom was left unsaid. I began noticing similar language elsewhere. Checkpoints described as transit markers. Zones labeled access points without physical descriptors. Instructions that emphasized timing over observation. The more I looked, the more it became clear that these weren't exceptions. They were part of a framework I had never been shown explicitly. The checkpoint wasn't there to be interacted with. It was there to synchronize movement. Once I understood that, the earlier silence made sense. There had been no follow-up because there was nothing to correct. The system had performed as designed. The convoy had crossed the marker. The condition had been met. From the system's perspective, the mission segment was complete. Human confirmation was optional. That was an uncomfortable thing to accept, especially in a line of work built on verification and redundancy. But the evidence supported it. Every attempt to treat Checkpoint 3 as a physical asset resulted in confusion. Every attempt to treat it as a procedural condition resulted in clarity. I considered documenting this realization, even privately. I decided against it. Language has a way of hardening observations into claims, and claims attract scrutiny. This wasn't something I needed examined. It was something I needed to navigate. From that point on, I treated certain locations differently. I didn't look for them. I prepared for them. I watched timing, spacing, and behavior rather than terrain. And when those elements aligned, I assumed we had crossed whatever boundary existed there, whether I could see it or not. Checkpoint 3 never reappeared. It remained in the packets. It remained in the system. It remained in the behavior of every convoy that passed through its coordinates, but it never again presented itself as a place. And that, more than its absence, confirmed that it had never truly been one. The realization changed the way I looked at routes entirely. I stopped thinking of them as lines drawn across terrain and started thinking of them as sequences, ordered movements through conditions that only occasionally express themselves as physical locations. Checkpoint 3 had been one of those conditions. The fact that it no longer manifested visually didn't mean it was gone. It meant it had transitioned into a different state. I tested that assumption quietly. On the next convoy I escorted along the same route, I altered nothing operationally. Same spacing, same speed, same radio discipline. The only difference was internal. I paid attention to the moment we crossed the coordinates again, watching for any change that could not be attributed to habit or expectation. The vehicles slowed slightly as they always did. Engines dipped in unison. The column compressed, then expanded. It was subtle enough that no one would have flagged it as noteworthy, but consistent enough that it could not be coincidence. The checkpoint still exerted influence. It just did so without form. I watched the terrain closely this time. Not for structures or personnel, but for absence. The road surface showed no wear patterns that would suggest repeated stops. No tire scarring. No disturbed earth. Nothing that would indicate the checkpoint had ever occupied physical space for more than a moment at a time. That raised another possibility I hadn't considered before. If the checkpoint had never been persistent, then its removal hadn't been an event. There had been nothing to dismantle, nothing to relocate. It hadn't disappeared because it had never fully existed in the way we understood existence. It had simply stopped appearing. That thought was reinforced during a later briefing when a logistics officer referred to the route as fully validated, not secured, not cleared, validated. The word choice was deliberate. Validation doesn't imply defense. It implies confirmation that something behaves as expected. Expected by whom was left unsaid. I began noticing similar language elsewhere. Checkpoints described as transit markers, zones labeled access points without physical descriptors, instructions that emphasized timing over observation. The more I looked, the more it became clear that these weren't exceptions. They were part of a framework I had never been shown explicitly. The checkpoint wasn't there to be interacted with. It was there to synchronize movement. Once I understood that, the earlier silence made sense. There'd been no follow-up because there was nothing to correct. The system had performed as designed. The convoy had crossed the marker. The condition had been met. From the system's perspective, the mission segment was complete. Human confirmation was optional. That was an uncomfortable thing to accept, especially in a line of work built on verification and redundancy, but the evidence supported it. Every attempt to treat Checkpoint 3 as a physical asset resulted in confusion. Every attempt to treat it as a procedural condition resulted in clarity. I considered documenting this realization, even privately. I decided against it. Language has a way of hardening observations into claims, and claims attract scrutiny. This wasn't something I needed examined. It was something I needed to navigate. From that point on, I treated certain locations differently. I didn't look for them. I prepared for them. I watched timing, spacing, and behavior rather than terrain. And when those elements aligned, I assumed we had crossed whatever boundary existed there, whether I could see it or not. Checkpoint 3 never reappeared. It remained in the packets. It remained in the system. It remained in the behavior of every convoy that passed through its coordinates. But it never again presented itself as a place. And that, more than its absence, confirmed that it had never truly been one. Once I accepted that some locations functioned without form, the work became easier and more unsettling. Easier because I stopped trying to reconcile what I saw with what I expected. More unsettling because expectation had always been the anchor that kept everything else stable. The next manifestation wasn't dramatic. It rarely is. It came during a pre-flight brief for a routine insertion rehearsal. No live operation, no target, just a timing run designed to validate crew coordination under low visibility. The route was familiar. The airspace was uncontested. Weather was nominal, the kind of mission you fly half on instinct. Halfway through the briefing, the mission planner paused on a slide longer than necessary. It showed a stretch of terrain marked only by a thin boundary line and a timestamp. No symbol, no annotation, no explanation. Someone asked if it was a hold point. The planner shook his head. "Transit alignment," he said, and moved on. That phrase surfaced again later that week, this time in a maintenance context. An avionics technician mentioned that certain navigation discrepancies were expected near alignment zones and should not be logged unless they exceeded tolerance for more than 30 seconds. I asked him how many such zones existed. He didn't answer directly. He just said, "Enough." By then, I had stopped assuming ignorance. People weren't confused. They were compartmentalized. Everyone knew just enough to do their part without needing to understand the whole. That's how complex systems survive. On the rehearsal flight, I felt it again. Not visually, not audibly. As we approached the alignment window, the aircraft's behavior smoothed out in a way that felt artificial. Controls felt lighter. Corrections required less input. The machine wasn't resisting gravity so much as cooperating with it. We crossed the timestamp exactly on cue. Nothing happened. And yet the moment passed with the same certainty as a waypoint. Back at base, I pulled historical flight data, not classified, just archived telemetry from routine operations. I wasn't looking for anomalies. I was looking for patterns in the absence of anomalies, places where error rates dropped below statistical expectation, where systems behaved better than they should have. The results were consistent. Certain coordinates produced cleaner data, less drift, fewer corrections, lower pilot workload. The aircraft didn't perform differently because of better conditions. It performed differently because conditions had been prepared. Prepared for what? That was the question no document ever asked. The implication was clear enough. These weren't hazards to be avoided or assets to be defended. They were features of an operational environment shaped to guide movement efficiently. Invisible infrastructure, not built to be seen, but to be crossed, which reframed everything about that first insertion. The landing zone hadn't appeared because we needed a place to land. It had appeared because the timeline required us to be there. Once the insertion was complete, there was no further need for expression. The system collapsed the feature back into latency, leaving behind no evidence that could be misinterpreted as permanence. That realization forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Pilots like me weren't navigating terrain. We were navigating states. And states don't care whether you understand them, only whether you comply. I didn't share this conclusion with anyone. There was no upside, no corrective action to be taken. You don't submit a hazard report on something that improves performance without explanation. Instead, I adjusted internally. I trusted instruments less when they insisted on clarity. I trusted timing more than sight. And I stopped assuming that the absence of markers meant the absence of structure. From that point forward, whenever a brief referenced validation, alignment, or non-persistent zones, I treated those moments with more attention than any hot LZ or contested corridor. Because those were the places where the system was most active, not reacting, but arranging. By the time I reached that conclusion, I had already changed the way I flew without consciously deciding to. It wasn't a procedural change, nothing you could point to in a checklist or justify in a briefing. It was subtler than that. A shift in what I paid attention to, and what I deliberately ignored. Pilots are trained to distrust intuition unless it can be validated by instrumentation. But alignment zones didn't announce themselves through instruments. They revealed themselves through consistency, through how little effort was required to maintain control, through how cleanly the aircraft seemed to pass through airspace that should have demanded more correction. I began to notice that these zones were never discussed during contingency planning. Emergency procedures assumed failure everywhere else: engine loss, degraded visibility, hostile fire, but never there, as if those spaces were considered inherently stable. That assumption unsettled me more than any hostile engagement ever had. During one operation several months later, we were tasked with extracting a team under time pressure. Weather had degraded faster than forecast. Winds were variable, visibility collapsing. Every metric suggested we should divert or delay. Instead, command adjusted the route by less than a kilometer and instructed us to hold a specific airspeed through a narrow corridor. No justification was given. As soon as we entered the revised path, turbulence dropped off abruptly, not gradually, but decisively. The aircraft stopped fighting the air. Even the sound profile changed. Less buffeting, less vibration transmitted through the frame. The crew noticed it too. No one said anything. That silence wasn't fear. It was recognition. You don't comment on things that everyone understands, but no one has permission to acknowledge. The extraction went smoothly, almost too smoothly. When we reviewed the footage afterward, there was a gap, 23 seconds of sensor data that didn't record properly. Not corrupted, just missing. The timestamps jumped forward without explanation. Maintenance chalked it up to a buffer issue. I didn't argue. What bothered me wasn't the missing data. It was that no one seemed interested in recovering it. In aviation, unexplained gaps are usually chased aggressively. Data is accountability. Data protects careers. This time, the absence was accepted without discussion. That told me the gap wasn't accidental. I started to think of these zones not as locations, but as permissions. Temporary allowances granted to move through space without resistance, as long as certain conditions were met. Time, heading, intent. Deviate too far from any of those, and the permission would simply not be granted. That would explain why visual confirmation wasn't required. Why the landing zone I had used once could not be reacquired later. You can't revisit something that was never meant to persist. It also explained why the system relied so heavily on pilots. Aircraft are liminal machines, neither fully grounded nor fully removed from the environment they traverse. They exist in transition. And pilots, especially in rotary wing platforms, operate constantly at the edge of stability. We feel deviations before sensors register them. We correct before limits are exceeded. We are ideal interfaces for something that requires alignment more than precision. That realization came with an unexpected side effect. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Every route adjustment, every oddly timed clearance, every instruction that prioritized synchronization over safety margins stood out. Not as mistakes, as signals. I wondered how many pilots before me had noticed and said nothing. How many had adapted quietly, folding the knowledge into their flying until it became instinct? How many had never noticed at all, trusting the system implicitly and benefiting from its corrections without question? Both outcomes were acceptable. The only unacceptable outcome would have been to disrupt the process by naming it. So I didn't. I flew. And every time the aircraft behaved better than it should have, I reminded myself of the same thing. This wasn't skill. This wasn't luck. And it certainly wasn't coincidence. It was compliance. And compliance, in this system, was rewarded with silence. After that realization settled in, the flights themselves became easier, but the space around them grew heavier. Not physically, psychologically. Once you understand that something is smoothing the path ahead of you, you also understand that deviation is no longer neutral. Every choice starts to feel observed, not by people, but by outcome. I began to notice how often our schedules aligned too cleanly. Briefings ended exactly when weather windows opened. Clearances arrived just as fuel margins reached their most efficient point. Delays happened only when they would not compromise the larger movement. It was as if friction existed everywhere, except where it would matter most. That should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like flying inside a system that already knew where it wanted me to be. During one rotation, I flew with a new co-pilot straight out of transition training. Sharp, disciplined, still rigid enough to trust instruments over instinct. Halfway through a night transit, he commented on how easy the air felt. That was his word. Easy. He laughed it off immediately, embarrassed by how untechnical it sounded. I didn't correct him, because he was right. The aircraft was holding altitude with minimal input. Power settings were stable in a way that made trim adjustments almost unnecessary. Even noise fatigue was lower. It was the kind of flight instructors dream of for students. Predictable, forgiving, clean. Except we were over terrain that should have punished that complacency. Later, during descent, we deviated slightly to avoid weather buildup. The moment we crossed a certain bearing, the aircraft started working again. Control pressures returned. Minor turbulence reappeared. Nothing dangerous, but unmistakable. I watched my co-pilot recalibrate without understanding why. We corrected back onto the original path. The ease returned. He didn't mention it again. That was when I understood the system didn't require belief. It only required participation. You didn't have to know why a route worked. You just had to stay within it. That distinction mattered because belief invites questions. Participation does not. I started paying attention to how routes were chosen during mission planning. Not the stated logic, but the assumptions. Certain corridors were reused without explanation. Certain altitudes favored even when others appeared safer. Certain headings avoided without justification. No one framed these as rules. They were treated as preferences, and preferences are rarely challenged. Once, during a planning session, a junior officer suggested an alternate insertion axis that would have shortened flight time. The room went quiet. Not tense, just paused. The lead planner nodded, acknowledged the suggestion, and then moved on without addressing it. The alternate axis was never discussed again. Afterward, I asked the planner privately why it wasn't considered. He didn't hesitate. "Because it doesn't resolve," he said. I asked what he meant. He frowned slightly, as if searching for a better word. "Because it complicates things." That was the closest anyone ever came to explaining it. The implication was clear. Some routes create downstream effects that don't justify their efficiency. They ripple in ways that are harder to correct later. Better to take the longer path that keeps everything aligned. That language, aligned, was never written down, never highlighted, but it appeared everywhere, disguised as prudence. The system wasn't optimizing for speed or safety alone. It was optimizing for continuity, and continuity didn't care about individuals. It cared about sequences, about ensuring that whatever came next arrived in the right condition, at the right time, with the least resistance. My role, I realized, was to deliver the aircraft and everyone inside it into those sequences intact. Nothing more, nothing less. The night insertion that started all of this had not been an anomaly. It had been an initiation. Not formal, not deliberate. Just exposure at the edge of something that had been running long before I encountered it. And once exposed, the only real choice was whether to fight it or flow with it. I chose to fly. Flowing with it did not mean surrender. That was something I had to understand slowly, because the distinction matters to pilots. You don't give up control. You redistribute it. You accept constraints, so the aircraft stays inside an envelope where control still exists. That was how it felt after that rotation. I stopped pushing against the pattern and started flying within it. Not consciously at first. It happened the same way good habits form. Small adjustments, reinforced by outcomes that made sense only after the fact. I noticed it most clearly during weather avoidance. Normally, weather is adversarial. You read it, predict it, then negotiate with it. Storm cells move faster or slower than forecast. Winds shear unexpectedly. Terrain amplifies effects in ways no model fully captures. You compensate. But on those routes, the ones that resolved, weather behaved differently. Cells still formed, but their edges softened just enough to pass cleanly. Turbulence existed, but it stayed within margins that never demanded abrupt correction. Even icing conditions appeared and cleared with uncanny timing. Not perfect, just workable. The first time I trusted it completely was unintentional. We were returning from a late insertion when an unexpected system moved in from the west. Forecast had shown it holding position for hours. It didn't. By the time we were inbound, the corridor we'd planned to use was closing fast. I ran the alternates automatically. Two options presented themselves. One was doctrinally correct but longer, fuel-tight, and would require coordination changes. The other was shorter, cleaner, but not one I had ever seen briefed before. It existed on the map, but only as empty airspace. No notes, no history. I hesitated. That hesitation lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then I took the second option. The moment we turned onto that heading, the aircraft stabilized. Winds that had been pushing us sideways aligned cleanly with our nose. The storm edge drifted just enough to open a gap that shouldn't have existed for another 20 minutes. We passed through without incident. When I reviewed the flight afterward, I realized something unsettling. The alternate route I'd chosen had not been cleared when I made the decision. Clearance had been logged 30 seconds later, as if the decision itself had been anticipated. I didn't mention it. At some point, you stop looking for confirmation because confirmation implies someone is watching closely enough to care. This didn't feel like that. It felt broader, structural. I began to think of it less as guidance and more as alignment pressure. The system didn't tell you where to go. It made certain directions easier than others. That distinction matters. Directives can be refused. Ease is persuasive. Over time, I noticed that pilots who resisted this, who insisted on flying strictly by doctrine even when the path felt wrong, experienced more friction. Not failures, just complications, delays, secondary checks, extra scrutiny. Nothing punishable, just inefficient. They didn't last long in those rotations. They transferred out, rotated home early, or quietly stopped getting selected for certain taskings. No one said why. No one needed to. I wasn't singled out because I adapted. An adaptation in aviation is praised. What troubled me wasn't that the system existed. It was that it worked best when no one tried to name it. The moment you gave it a label, you introduced resistance. Language creates edges. Edges catch. So everything remained procedural, boring, normal. Until one night, during a pre-flight, I noticed a change to our nav package. Not an update, an omission. A small region of terrain data had been smoothed, contours simplified, detail reduced. I asked maintenance if there'd been a data corruption. They checked. No errors, they said. That's the current build. I pulled up an older archive for comparison. The detail had been there before. It was gone now. Not deleted, abstracted. That was when it clicked fully. The system wasn't just guiding movement through space. It was reshaping space to make guidance unnecessary. And if that was true, then the landing zone that wasn't on any map hadn't been a failure of documentation. It had been documentation catching up too slowly. Once you accept that space itself can be adjusted, you stop treating maps as representations and start treating them as negotiations. That was the shift that changed how I flew. Not recklessly, not intuitively. Deliberately. I still trusted instruments, still respected procedures, still logged everything that mattered. But I stopped assuming the map was neutral. Neutrality is a comforting myth. After the nav data smoothing incident, I began comparing builds whenever I could. Not obsessively, quietly. The differences were subtle, but they followed a pattern. Areas associated with transient operations and lost detail over time. Elevation variance flattened. Minor features disappeared. Routes that had proven reliable gained clarity, while others became vague without ever being marked as restricted. Nothing was removed outright. It was softened until it no longer invited use. During one deployment, a senior warrant officer pulled me aside after a routine flight. He asked how the route had felt, not whether it had been safe, not whether we'd encountered weather. Felt, I answered honestly. Clean. He nodded. That was all. A week later, that same route appeared in the next planning cycle as a preferred corridor. No explanation attached, just a quiet elevation in status. That's how the system learned, not through reports, through sensation translated into policy. I began to suspect that pilots were being used as filters, not consciously. We weren't asked to evaluate alignment or continuity. We were simply allowed to experience ease or resistance, and those experiences were aggregated somewhere far above us. The realization didn't make me feel exploited. It made me feel obsolete. If the system could infer outcomes from aggregated behavior, then individual judgment was no longer the primary control mechanism. It was an input variable, weighted and averaged until it lost its edges. One night, flying a resupply run under marginal conditions, I encountered a region of air that felt wrong in the opposite way. Not heavy, not resistant, empty. Control inputs produced response, but the response lagged, as if the aircraft were moving through a medium that didn't fully couple. I slowed immediately, called it in, requested a minor course adjustment. Denied. The denial wasn't abrupt. It was phrased as advisory. Remain as briefed. I complied. The sensation passed within seconds, but it left an impression. That absence, the lack of feedback, was worse than turbulence. Turbulence tells you where the air is. This told me nothing. Back at base, I asked an analyst I trusted whether there had been any recent changes in that region. He paused, then said, "That area's been deprecated." Deprecated? Not closed, not restricted. Deprecated implies function without support, something that still exists but is no longer meant to be used. I asked why. He didn't answer directly. It complicates synchronization. That word again. Synchronization. It appeared everywhere once I started listening for it. Not in briefings, but in how outcomes were discussed. Events didn't fail. They desynchronized. Assets weren't lost. They were misaligned. Adjustments weren't corrections. They were resyncs. Language is a trail if you know how to follow it. I realized then that the landing zone from that first night hadn't been created for us. It had been created for timing. The insertion wasn't about where the team went. It was about when they arrived. The ground had resolved long enough to accept that moment, then released it. The map hadn't failed to record it. The map had never been the authoritative source. Time was. That reframed everything. Why the clocks disagreed slightly on egress. Why fuel burn didn't match distance. Why clearance arrived after the decision. Why weather opened gaps on cue. These weren't errors. They were tolerances. The system wasn't bending space arbitrarily. It was maintaining temporal coherence across operations too complex to manage linearly. Once I understood that, I stopped looking for edges. Edges are where things break. The system didn't break. It yielded. During my final rotation, I flew fewer missions. Not because I was sidelined, but because the schedule simply didn't place me where friction existed anymore. Newer pilots took those routes. They brought fresh noise into the data, fresh variance. I watched from a distance. The night before I rotated home for the last time, I flew a short hop alone. No insertion, no cargo, just repositioning an aircraft. The route was clean, familiar, unremarkable. Halfway through, I felt it again. That sense of narrowing, not spatial, temporal. As if the air ahead had already decided how quickly I should pass through it. I didn't resist. When I landed, the time on the clock matched exactly what the system had predicted hours earlier. Perfect alignment. No margin. That was the moment I knew my usefulness had peaked. Not because I was incapable, but because I was too predictable. The system no longer needed my input to learn. I filed the flight. I shut down, and I let the system continue without me. After I stopped flying operational missions, the absence felt louder than the work ever had. Aviation leaves an imprint on you. Rhythms, tolerances, the constant negotiation between control and surrender. When that stops, you expect relief. What you don't expect is the lingering sense that something is still accounting for your movement, even when you're no longer moving inside it. Civilian life returned the way it does for most pilots. Simulators, consultancy, occasional ferry flights, predictable airspace, predictable outcomes. Everything behaved the way it was supposed to. And yet, every so often, I would notice a hesitation in the world, a delay between cause and effect that felt familiar, not dramatic, not alarming, Just a moment where alignment seemed to be checked before continuing. I saw it once in an airport terminal during a routine delay. Weather wasn't the issue. Maintenance wasn't the issue. The aircraft was ready. Crew was ready. Passengers were boarded. And still, departure was held for 9 minutes without explanation. Exactly 9. No announcement followed. No justification offered. The flight departed smoothly afterward, as if nothing had happened. Most people forgot about it before takeoff. I didn't, because 9 minutes is a correction window. That's how I started thinking about it after I left. Not as guidance or control, but as correction. Small, quiet adjustments that keep larger systems from drifting into instability. You don't stop events from happening. You shape when and how they happen so they don't cascade. That's what the landing zone had been. Not a place, a correction. A temporary alignment between terrain, aircraft, and time that allowed an insertion to occur without disturbing anything downstream. Once the moment passed, the alignment released. There was no reason for the place to remain. Maps were never meant to capture it. Maps describe persistence. That zone was never persistent. I sometimes wonder how many others like it have existed since. How many have resolved just long enough to accept a convoy, a team, a shipment, a decision? How many never left a trace because no one thought to question their absence? Most pilots wouldn't. They trust what works, and the system works because it doesn't demand belief. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't punish disbelief. It simply makes some paths easier than others and waits for you to choose. That's the part people misunderstand when they imagine control. They picture force, authority, directives. This was never that. This was alignment, and alignment feels like good judgment. Years later, I pulled the original flight logs one last time. Everything matched. Times, fuel, coordinates, signatures. There was no anomaly that could be proven without already knowing where to look. The landing zone existed only in the overlap between intent and execution, which is why it couldn't be found again. I don't tell this story because I think something is wrong with the world. I tell it because, for one night, I saw how carefully the world is being kept from breaking. I flew a night insertion to a landing zone that wasn't on any map. The aircraft landed. The team disembarked. Time stayed intact. And that was the point. If you're looking for the landing zone now, you won't find it. You never were meant to.